Women should be humble. Women should be respectful. Women should be obedient. These misogynistic ideals shaped the lives of Chinese women for over 2,000 years. Even today, the stereotypes of Chinese women as docile and submissive still exist. And yes, patriarchy, emperors, and even our beloved Confucius had a lot to do with it. But what if I told you the person who wrote these ideals into a guidebook for the conduct of Chinese women was a woman herself? Her name was Ban Zhao of the Eastern Han Dynasty. She is widely considered to be the first female historian of Chinese history, and the text she wrote was called the Nü Jie, the Lessons for Women. Hi everyone, I'm Amy. Today let's talk about what Ban Zhao's Lessons for Women actually are, and explore why a woman would create such a misogynistic guide to women's conduct. But before we get to that, let's quickly talk about who Ban Zhao was. Born around 45 CE, Ban Zhao was born into the prominent noble Ban family, a family of scholars and historians. Her family produced two important historians of Chinese history, and one of her brothers even became a celebrated general. She tutored empresses, she advised an empress dowager, and she was a highly respected figure at court. After her historian brother, Ban Gu, died in 92 CE, she took over the responsibilities of finishing his work on a historical record, the Book of Han, and her contribution was essential to its final completion. Clearly, Ban Zhao was an exceptional woman. She was educated, she was accomplished, and she was deeply involved in the intellectual and political life of her time, which made it so much stranger that she would go on to author a text that later generations would read as a guide to female submission for centuries. Now, to be clear, Ban Zhao did not invent these ideals. These ideals had already existed long before she was born. But she was one of the first to organize them into a teachable philosophy. For her work, Ban Zhao was highly praised in later dynasties, and even referred to as the Confucius of women in the Qing dynasty. But today, some modern critics portray her as a great enemy of women, accusing her of poisoning the minds of Chinese women for nearly 2,000 years. Was she actually standing up for women's rights in a world where it was difficult to do so? Or was she actually a believer of her own guide and complicit in the very source of centuries of women's suffering in China? Let's take a look at her actual lessons for women and decide for ourselves. Before Ban Zhao gets into the rules themselves, she writes a preface. She begins by calling herself foolish and unlearned. She says she married into the Cao family at the age of 14, and that for more than 40 years she lived in constant fear. Fear of doing something wrong, fear of embarrassing her family, fear of being cast out. 40 years of marriage, described as 40 years of trembling and fear. Her fear wasn't unique. It reflects the precarious position of wives in many noble households. This is the framing of the world that she lived in. She then explains why she is writing. Her daughters are old enough to be married. She is sick, possibly dying. She is afraid that she has not prepared them. She worries that if they do not know the rules, they will bring shame on their future husband's households and disgrace the family. She ends with something that feels almost abrupt. Work hard and do your best. There is a feeling of anxiety, the anxiety of a mother who knows she is running out of time. Today, scholars and historians point out that the worried mother framing was most likely a deliberate choice. Because in that time period, women were usually not supposed to speak with public authority, and claiming that she was writing for her own daughters was a clever way to present her words. Be humble and yielding. Put others before yourself. The first lesson is about a woman's fundamental orientation toward the world. Ban Zhao calls it 卑弱, lowliness and weakness. Or in other words, humility. She opens with an ancient ritual. In the China of her era, when a girl was born, 3 specific things happened. She was placed on the floor, not a bed. She was given a pottery shard as a toy, not jade or bronze. And the birth was reported to the ancestors with fasting and a ceremony. Each act, Ban Zhao says, carries a meaning. Placed on the floor, her position in the world is below others. Given a pottery shard, her life work is domestic labor. Reported to the ancestors, she will one day bear responsibility for the family rights. These 3 acts, she argues, encode everything a woman needs to know about her place. And from that foundation, Ban Zhao builds 3 duties. The first is humility. Put others before yourself. Do not claim credit for your virtues. Do not make excuses for your faults. Endure insults without complaint. Remain always as if in a state of cautious fear. The second is diligence. Wake early, sleep late. Do not avoid hard work. The third is to maintain the rights, the household offerings, the ancestral ceremonies, the obligations that bind the family across generations. And then she makes a promise. If you fulfill these 3 duties, she says, there has never been a case where a woman's good reputation did not become known, or where disgrace fell upon her. Ban Zhao is making an argument that if a woman behaved this way, then the household would protect her. In a world where a woman's entire security, her food, her shelter, even the futures of her children, depended on whether or not the family she married into would keep her, that promise was not a small thing. These rules were, in her framing, a form of protection. And on the other hand, if a woman is unable to complete her 3 duties, what good name could she possibly hope for? What disgrace could she possibly avoid? To teach only the sons and not the daughters, is this not a failure to see both sides of the matter? The second lesson is about marriage as a partnership, and it opens with something that kind of surprised me, considering the tone of this text comes off as misogynistic so far. Ban Zhao makes a direct argument for women's education. Everyone agrees, she says, that a husband must be capable in order to lead his household well. But no one seems to think about whether the wife has been given what she needs to fulfill her role. Boys are educated formally from the age of 8. Girls receive nothing comparable. And then everyone acts surprised when things go wrong. But let's be clear about what kind of argument this is. Ban Zhao is not saying women should be educated so they can do equal things to men. She is saying women should be educated so they can better serve their role within the marriage. But it makes an important observation that the system is inconsistent and that it demands a standard it refuses to teach. And coming from the most accomplished female scholar of her era, it carries weight. She frames marriage in the grandest possible terms. The relationship between husband and wife mirrors the relationship between yang and yin, between heaven and earth. It is not a private arrangement between 2 people. It is a reflection of cosmic order. And that means both people within it carry real responsibilities. She says, if the husband is not worthy, he cannot lead his wife. If the wife is not worthy, she cannot serve her husband. The logic runs in both directions, but that was not a given in her time period. Most texts of this era addressed themselves only to men and treated women as an afterthought. Ban Zhao is insisting that the marriage relationship requires 2 functioning people, and that producing 2 functioning people requires educating both of them. It is in this lesson that I think we can see a hidden message behind the official one. In addition to education for womanly duties, was this lesson also an argument for equal education in a world where that was unheard of? Living together day after day, contempt arises. Once contempt arises, words become careless. The third lesson is about how a woman should behave inside a marriage. Ban Zhao starts with an observation. When 2 people live together long enough, they get too comfortable. Familiarity breeds carelessness. Carelessness breeds contempt. And contempt, once it takes root in a marriage, is very difficult to remove. She continues, contempt leads to careless words. Careless words leads to willfulness. Willfulness leads to disrespect. And disrespect, in a world where a husband had significant legal authority over his wife, could lead somewhere much worse. She says, if anger is not contained, physical beatings will follow. And if physical beatings take place, what duty is left? At first, I thought, oh no, is she blaming the victims of domestic violence? But to understand what Ban Zhao is doing here, I think we first have to understand the world she was writing for. In the Han Dynasty, a husband held a significant legal authority over his wife. It was very difficult for a wife to leave a marriage, and there were no institutions like modern shelters that she could turn to if the marriage became abusive. If a marriage turned violent, the law offered her very little protection. And in many cases, her natal family would be reluctant to take her back. And unfortunately, this was not a situation that was unique to ancient China. Did you know that domestic violence was technically legal in the United States until the late 1800s? And even then, it was only made illegal in a few states. It would take many more decades for it to become illegal in all states. And even then, police would rarely make arrests for domestic violence well into the late 1900s. So we can only imagine how much worse it would be almost 2,000 years ago. But Ban Zhao couldn't change her world. And regardless of what she personally believed, if she spoke out against it directly, it wouldn't help anybody and would instead get herself in big trouble. So instead, it looks like she approached the topic from the perspective of trying to teach her daughters how to survive in this world, how to minimize the chances of domestic violence, in a world where domestic violence was acceptable. Her advice was to treat your husband with consideration, even if you don't want to, because the alternative would be much worse. She does not speak to the husband because she is unable to lecture him, and he wouldn't listen to her anyway. So instead, she speaks to the wife about what women can do to manage the man they're bound to, because if the relationship ends in violence, then the husband and wife are entirely driven apart. A woman has 4 paths of proper conduct. The 4th lesson is about the 4 virtues of women, 四德. These 4 virtues were based on existing Confucian ideals of female modesty, proper speech, womanly conduct, and feminine restraint. But Ban Zhao was the first to organize them in a way that would ingrain them into Chinese culture for many future generations. The first virtue, 妇德, is womanly virtue. Ban Zhao says that a woman does not require exceptional talent or brilliance. Instead, what a woman requires is consistency, a steadiness of moral character, a sense of shame that keeps conduct in check, and propriety in both action and rest. The second virtue, 妇言, is womanly speech. Ban Zhao explains that this does not mean the saying of right or impressive words. Instead, it means choosing your words carefully, not speaking maliciously, speaking only when the moment calls for it. Don't tire people with your words, she says. Know when to stop. The third virtue, 妇容, is womanly appearance. Ban Zhao says that this does not mean being beautiful. She says it is about cleanliness. Wash yourself regularly. Keep your clothes clean. Do not let yourself become unkept. The standard is hygiene and self-care, not youth or prettiness. The 4th virtue, 妇工, is womanly work. Ban Zhao says that a woman's work is spinning and weaving, preparing food, managing the household, receiving guests properly. The woman is responsible for the domestic labor that keeps a household functioning. It is interesting to point out that with each virtue, Ban Zhao also explicitly points out what a woman should not do. And then she concludes the lesson by stating that putting them into practice is actually quite simple. It is entirely a matter of intent. With this lesson, she is teaching her daughters how to become socially acceptable and non-threatening inside the household system of her time. The husband is heaven, and heaven cannot be escaped. The 5th lesson is about devotion, and it is with this lesson that Ban Zhao tries to explain the constraints of the world that she lived in. According to the Book of Rights, a husband may remarry after his wife's death, but there is no equivalent provision for a wife. While remarriage was possible and actually relatively common in the Han Dynasty, the ideological expectation was that a widow should remain loyal to her deceased husband. Ban Zhao says that a husband is like heaven, and just as one cannot escape heaven, a wife cannot leave her husband. She preaches that a woman should conduct herself with the same composure and propriety whether she was inside the home or outside it. That a woman should not dress to attract attention when she goes out. That a woman should not become lazy when she is at home. That a woman's ears should not dwell on things they should not hear. And that a woman should not let her eyes linger where they should not look. And in a world where it was not easy for a woman to leave her husband, and it was frowned upon for a woman to remarry, Ban Zhao teaches her daughters how to work within the system. But what Ban Zhao could not have foreseen is that this lesson would become treated as the most virtuous one, and heavily amplified by Neo-Confucian culture to restrict women in later dynasties. And I also want to bring up something tragic that I think is related to this lesson. Ban Zhao's own great-aunt, Lady Ban Jieyu, was a consort to Emperor Chen of Han. Lady Ban Jieyu is remembered in Chinese history as an ideal example of a virtuous woman. In one famous story, Emperor Chen invited Lady Ban Jieyu to ride alongside him in his personal carriage. But Lady Ban Jieyu refused, saying that an emperor should be seen with his ministers, not his consorts, to avoid any perception of impropriety. This is a story that would be repeated many times throughout Chinese history, using Lady Ban Jieyu as an example of how a virtuous woman should be. However, what is less known is that despite Lady Ban Jieyu's virtue, she was ultimately cast aside by the emperor in favor of his new favorites, the infamous Zhao Feiyan and her sister Zhao Hede. Lady Ban Jieyu would spend the rest of her days in isolation, writing poems of sadness. This is the harsh reality of the world that Ban Zhao was writing for. Even if a woman was virtuous and properly devoted to her husband, she could still be abandoned. But what other choices did a woman have? A husband may deeply love his wife, but if his parents says she is in wrong, the marriage is effectively broken by duty. The sixth lesson is about the relationship with a woman's in-laws. And Ban Zhao's advice is comply, even when she is wrong. She says, if your mother-in-law says a thing is wrong when it is actually right, you must follow her orders. If she says a thing is right when it is actually wrong, you must still obey her command. Do not argue over who is right and who is wrong, and do not fight to prove your innocence. This is actually a lesson that can still be seen in Chinese culture, even today. Although nowadays, these expectations are also often applied to the way a husband should interact with his wife's family. Back in the Han Dynasty, a new bride did not just join a household. She entered in as an outsider with no standing of her own. Everything she would come to have and the quality of life that she would enjoy was almost entirely dependent on whether her in-laws accepted her. But to better understand the context of what Ban Zhao is teaching, let me tell you about a Han Dynasty poem called The Peacock Flies Southeast, 孔雀东南飞. This poem tells the story of a young woman named Liu Lanzhi, who married a minor official named Jiao Zhongqing. The couple loved each other deeply. Liu Lanzhi was an ideal daughter-in-law, hardworking, skilled at weaving, respectful, and beautiful. But her mother-in-law disliked her. There was no specific reasons given, no accusations of misconduct. The mother-in-law simply did not approve of the marriage and made her son's life impossible until he agreed to send his wife away. Liu Lanzhi returned to her family in shame. Her brother, ashamed of her status, forced her into a new engagement with another man. But on the night before her second wedding, she drowned herself. And when Jiao Zhongqing heard the news, he hanged himself in his courtyard. This poem became one of the most beloved tragedies in Chinese literary tradition, and is sometimes referred to today as the Chinese Romeo and Juliet. It is still taught in Chinese schools today. and it basically explains a world where the mother-in-law had power over the wife, and even love could not overcome it. In a world like that, it didn't really matter who was right or wrong. A woman could win an argument, but lose everything else. Ban Zhao isn't necessarily saying that compliance is morally correct, but she is saying that it is necessary for women's survival. When a household is in harmony, everyone's faults are covered up. But when a family is divided, every flaw is put on display for the world to see. The seventh and last lesson is about preserving peace inside the larger family network. It is about getting along with a sister-in-law, younger relatives, and other women of the extended family. Ban Zhao explains that a wife's standing with her husband depends on her in-laws' affection, and her in-laws' affection depends on the praise of the brothers and sisters-in-law. A woman's standing and favor in a household is slowly shaped through the accumulation of impressions, comments, small endorsements, or quiet criticisms passed through family conversation over years and decades. A wife who was warmly spoken of by her husband's siblings had allies where it counted. A wife who was resented by them was quietly undermined at every turn, often in ways she might not even see happening until the damage was done. Ban Zhao says that a virtuous, modest, and compliant woman knows how to rely on duty to deepen these relationships and lean on mutual kindness to build alliances. Her advice is simple. Be humble, be generous, do not compete, do not use your husband's favor as a weapon against the people around you. Understand that you are living inside a system of relationships, and that those relationships are either working for you or against you. There is rarely a neutral position. Ban Zhao concludes with, to secure the hearts of your brothers and sisters-in-law, nothing is more powerful than modesty and compliance. Modesty is the handle of virtue, and compliance is the proper conduct of the wife. But there is also an ironic story regarding this final lesson. According to later historical records, Ban Zhao's own sister-in-law, a woman named Cao Fengshen, would later read these lessons for women and write a formal rebuttal. Unfortunately, the actual words of the rebuttal were not recorded. But it does indicate that Cao Fengshen at least did not fully agree with it. Does this mean that even though Ban Zhao preaches for harmony within the household, she herself did not achieve it? Ban Zhao's lessons for women was completed around 112 CE. It would spread from household to household, dynasty to dynasty, and would later become the first of the 4 books for women, used to educate girls in China right up through the early 20th century. For nearly 2,000 years, these lessons for women would shape expectations placed on Chinese women, how they should speak, how they should behave in a household, how they should treat their in-laws, how they should devote themselves to their husbands. Now, let's return to the question that was raised at the beginning of this video. Ban Zhao was an extraordinary woman who did not conceal her own brilliance. She did not stay within the household. She was actively engaged in politics and government affairs. But she wrote lessons telling women to be humble, silent, and submissive. Some historians argue that these lessons were never really about her daughters. They suggest that it was more political in nature, aimed at addressing the increasing improper influence of noblewomen inside the imperial palace. In the Eastern Han Dynasty, powerful empress dowagers, consort families, and palace women had become deeply involved in court politics and succession struggles. Maybe Ban Zhao was trying to promote a more restrained and proper model of elite female conduct in response to this environment. Others argue that Ban Zhao genuinely believed what she wrote, that she herself supported the ideals of women being docile and obedient. But other historians point out that maybe she was trying to speak out against the injustice against women, disguised in lessons for them. And hidden inside these lessons are repeated acknowledgments of how vulnerable women actually were, because this was the only way she could get her words out. We will never know her true motives, but we do know the lasting impact of her efforts. When you watch a Chinese historical drama today, and you see a woman lower her gaze at the right moment, or defer gracefully to her mother-in-law, or find quiet, indirect ways to say what she cannot say directly, you're watching the results of what Ban Zhao left behind. What do you think about these lessons for women? If you were Ban Zhao, what would your lessons be for women of that time? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed today's video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
Stay curious, stay magical.